believe Conflicted Cylon, the designer, I believe, is here in chat. I think I saw them earlier.
I hope so.
So if you're here, please jump in with any info that I miss or that I. Oh, there he is. Okay, so this was by Conflicted Cylon, which I feel like that username is a whole bag that we might have to unpack at a later time. But barring that, and I just want to say real quick, I'm a tremendous fan of small cube, of like 2-player cube, because especially in an environment like we're in now, if you're lucky enough to have a person that you can play with, regular cube can be a challenge. So being able to enjoy cube with one other person where it's designed that way that's always been up my alley. But anyway, so this is a small cube, a 2-player Naya Cube. My understanding is basically the designer was inspired by Ryan Overturf's article on his 2-player cube, Tuberts, and it made him decide to try his hand at his own cube, his own 2-player cube, and then he did what most people do, which is go to the internet and try to find information on 2-player cube. And if you do that, you will not find a whole lot. It's actually I think pretty hard to find like good like how-to kind of information. There's a lot more cubes out there now. But anyway, one of the things that Cylon had in mind was to limit it to 3 colors in order to kind of create a little added tension in the draft. And I agree with this, with a 5-color cube, it's pretty easy. Like if y'all get into Dimir and I get into Boros, like we're not really fighting over many cards. Maybe there's like 1 or 2 like equipment in there that for some reason there's some tension over. But in the draft, we're pretty likely to just get into our lane and then just follow our colors. So the idea of narrowing it down, I agree with pretty highly. So it's a Naya cube. There's no blue or black. And I just want to say, quick shout out to Cylon. We see why they're conflicted deep down. The reason that he picked these colors is because his partner's least favorite colors are blue and black. How much love is
Fair
that?
Enough.
How much love is that right there?
Fair enough.
I would be like, those are your least favorite colors. Please see my Dimir cube.
Right, you gotta
I love you, but I also love blue black. So
making cubes and change heart and minds is also a good reason to make a cube. To convince somebody to appreciate different things about Magic. But
Absolutely.
no, I think that's a good reason, good enough reason to focus on just Naya.
Well, and here's the cool thing too. It was either in the write-up here or somewhere else. He also said that Naya were the colors that he tended to avoid, and I also think that's like a big level up. Is like it's kind of like we were talking about as we were warming up. Forcing yourself to play stuff that you're not comfortable with or that's not your go-to is a great way to like get better at Magic, right? So I think those are both excellent ways to go. I'm not gonna read through the archetypes. We've got the link, and if anyone needs it, please let us know. Thanks, Pab, for sharing it. We can drop it again if the chat runs past it. But there's a very well thought out, great write up here. Cylon, just want to say like this is a really good use of the markdown on Cube Cobra. But that being said, let's jump into the list. And I'm going to start with list view, but if there's any requests for any other information, I can switch it up. Gentlemen, do either of you have a thought that you want to lead off with on this cube or something that you've noticed or a question for the designer?
I always throw it to Anthony because I talk too much.
Sure.
And so it's good for me
Big
to make
same.
sure I talk. I've learned over my adult life.
No comment.
You have no comment?
I mean, if I follow my heart, Naya is also where I belong.
All right.
See, I think banned.
But I also realize that ultimately I am Dimir.
You think so? I don't think you're evil or sneaky.
I feel that this 3-color versus 2-color pair is a dichotomy.
Yeah, legit.
It's relevant to many people.
Color pie is the best thing about Magic. I love it.
It really is.
Yep.
I mean, I see a lot of what I would expect in this cube. I see a lot of powerful cards in these colors, and I'm excited to see where it goes.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I love the idea of making a 2-player cube. I think one thing that we've learned from having the podcast is that a lot of people don't realize you can cube with 2 people.
Yep.
Like we've posted our podcast on more general forums and people are like, Cube, you think I have 7 friends just around to draft all the time? And it's like, you don't need that. And I also like the idea of designing a cube with a specific audience in mind, as opposed to being like, I think oftentimes people design a cube with the idea of like, this is a general cube for everybody to love.
The masses.
Like, right, and that's great and all, but it's so much more helpful to know like who you're designing for. And so if you're designing for you and your partner, or you and your couple friends,
you're making a cube for your friends.
I mean, it's a huge challenge to make a cube for everybody. So making a cube for just the people you know you're making it for is great. So I love the sort of focus of making a 2-player cube, and I think limiting the colors makes a ton of sense for all the reasons we talked about. You know, the fact that you're going to plan to draft this environment. There's no reason to have a bunch of extra cards you're not going to draft with if there's just 2 people. So focusing on just 3 colors, so you can basically really actually have that interplay of like, well, which color is you, which colors am I, reading signals, that kind of stuff, and not just like kind of being in totally separate lanes and ignoring each other completely.
Right.
I think all that makes a ton of sense to me. And so, yeah, I think the list is great. I did look at it. I have a bunch of thoughts, but I don't really want to go super deep on it until we start, I don't know, talking about it in more depth. I don't know.
Sure.
So wait, I'm sorry. This is meant to be grid draft, right?
No, this is pancake draft. It's the way this person designed for it to be drafted. So 9 packs of 10, and then pancake draft is pick 1, pick 2, burn 2, pick 2, burn remaining 3 is the pancake draft, which I'm sure we've done before. We've done all the drafts though. Yeah. So you get to basically like, you pick 1 and then you just pass it back. So you don't get to burn anything out of the first pick. And then the second pick, you pick 2, burn 2. And then the last pick, you pick 2 and burn the rest of the pack.
I'm going to be honest. I don't love that type of draft.
Okay.
So,
just burn drafting in general?
Well, especially like 2-player burn drafting. So I'm trying to think about like how the color limitation interacts with that specific type of draft.
Sure.
With grid draft, which I have more experience with, I honestly still enjoy playing 5 colors. Like the idea of limiting the colors so you have a more constrained kind of set of draft archetypes makes perfect sense.
Yep.
But honestly, when I do grid drafts, I feel like I end up honestly overlapping a color with my opponent more often.
For sure.
Not.
Yeah.
Because like hate drafting is such a big part of it.
Yep.
And when you end up like doing enough hate drafts, then you end up kind of like fighting for a color.
Yep.
It seems pretty natural.
Yep. Well, the other thing with grid, I was just gonna say, the other thing is like sometimes just the grid tells you like, oh, you want that blue card and that red card. Like there's a green card in between it, and you just get it, and then that happens like 3 times, and you're like, I have good green cards. Like, oh, teamer.
And so I feel like with like a 3-color grid draft, I feel like almost just it's too easy. Like everything is playable. Like it would be too easy to fall into just you're just drafting the good stuff deck and you'll splash 1 color. But how is that different from pancake draft? Like, are you really finding yourself trying to fit into 1 lane? Can you actually effectively hate draft?
I mean, in my experience, if you can't hate draft, you can burn.
Yeah.
You know, strategically.
Right.
Basically, like I think it's important to pay attention to what you're passing in pancake draft, especially in that first pick of the first couple packs, because you can't burn anything out of the first couple packs. So it's like, you know, usually we talk about on the show how like I would never not take a blue card out of a pack because there's another good blue card in it. But if there's 2 really good cards in 1 color, I know I'm passing this pack back to my opponent. I mean, in this case, there's only 3 colors. I expect we're going to share at least 1 color. So maybe that's just the color we share. We think about it that way. But yeah, I don't know. I think in the pancake drafts I've done, I feel like this is Dave's preferred draft format is pancake drafting, which, I feel like oftentimes I end up burning a bunch of cards that I think my opponent's going to care about, and rarely do they actually care about them. And I'm like, well, I thought I knew it. You know, it happens sometimes.
Okay, so wait, maybe the bigger question is like, color is just 1 axis of synergy, and there are challenges in 2-player drafts with synergy, or with 5 colors. Are there a lot of other strong axes of synergy in this particular cube?
Yeah, so in this particular cube, like I am not seeing like board wipes, right? I mean, increasing devotion, no. Shadow of the Sky is a board wipe. That's 1. So like something I do find myself doing in pancake drafts is burning cards that are good against me. Obviously, like I'll basically say like, you know what, I'm not going to play this meta game of trying to figure out what you, my opponent, are doing, but I'm going to just cut cards that are good against the deck I know I'm drafting. And if you're in those colors, great. If you're not, you know, no skin off my back. So, you know, basically knowing your opponent is not on what appears to be the 1 board is Blasphemous Act and Wildfire too. So there's a couple in red as well.
I was going to say Wildfire is spicy as fuck. And
Yeah,
two-player
there's some
cube.
spice in this list for
This is
sure. I
spice,
think
yep.
definitely some spice here.
Yep.
That's something I'll be aware of. It's just like, burning the cards that are really good against me,
Yep.
and basically not really caring about my opponent's colors, and trying to
Totally.
So
But I guess,
divine that.
I guess what I'm wondering more than just that is like, in a 3-color draft, unless the format is extremely fast, you can basically play all the cards you draft, right?
Well, so that was
Right.
going to be what I was going to say. So one of my first inclinations when I saw this cube list, just because I love mana fixing, was like, there should be more mana fixing. There should always be more mana fixing. I feel like a lot of cube designers operate on assumptions that are inherited from retail draft. And in retail draft, your mana is just awful. It's always awful. Your mana is always awful. Even in sets that are dedicated to gold cards and guilds and stuff, your mana is still awful. It's terrible.
Yeah.
And you have a bunch of picks that just go, why are you holding your hand up?
You say it's awful,
Yeah.
but also you're drafting awful cards, so it works together. Everything's
that
fine.
work
But
Yeah.
if you could cast your awful cards on curve,
Let's not call it. I feel like even retail draft is diminutive. It's derogatory. Like it's a premier draft.
you can call it whatever you want. When you're opening booster packs,
Excellent.
look,
Opening booster packs is the best way to play that.
Wizards has a lot of conflicting motivations to the cards they put in a booster pack.
Truth.
Yes.
A lot of which have nothing to do
Truth.
with drafting it.
Correct.
I would argue if they were just making a part to be drafted and not to like put cards into standard or modern or legacy, or to have a pack that was fun to open for random casual players that weren't drafting at all but just wanted to open and fun backup cards, I think they'd have 4 or 5 times as many lands. So my first inclination was like, more fixing. Fixing's great. But then I was like, oh, actually, the whole 3-color pretense is kind of ruined if I can just play all 3 colors no matter what I'm drafting.
Right, yeah.
And so actually maybe fixing is something that needs to be carefully limited here
Sure.
Yeah.
to only focus on 2 colors. To that end, one of the first thoughts I had is, we see some fetches here and some shocks,
Yep.
classically some of the best kind of fixing lands, but also some of the best lands to put you explicitly in 3 colors. Your Wooded Foothills, your Windswept Heath, your not your Sacred Foundry, your Arid Mesa can all be 3-color lands. I almost wonder if the fixing here should be focused on just 2 colors. Every fixing land, it just helps you with your 1 guild. And so it's like, if you want to prioritize fixing and then take a splash of that 3rd color, you can, as long as you really prioritize it, but you're not going to get free, 3-color fixing, and just focus on every card being only a specific guild.
It appeals to my style.
I dig it.
Hey, thanks, buddy.
So quick pause, just because in the chat, Cylon was asking a little bit about
I want to ask some good questions.
preferred style of drafting with 2 players. And Cylon, I wanted to ask you a quick question before we go too far, which is just very roughly, you and your partner, what are your Magic like experience levels? Like, are you both very experienced players? Is one of you newer than the other? Are you both very new? Just because that also helps inform, like, personally where I would start with 2-player draft. Because there's a lot with a 2-player draft. There's a lot going on, and that's true with an 8-player draft. But I think sometimes sitting directly across from someone and drafting like against them is actually, I don't know, harder. Maybe that's just me, but sometimes that feels a little more intense. But one of the methods I'd actually recommend so grid draft is one of my favorites for sure. I love grid draft for a variety of reasons, but and I have not done any like real like burn drafting before. But one that I really like as a 2-player variant, especially if you're a little bit on the newer side or 1-player. Okay. Cool. So your partner's much newer. Okay. So here and
Your newer, but it sounds like a lot smarter than you.
much smarter. Yeah.
From this message in the chat.
Cylon is like me. Cylon has married well above.
Hey, me too,
up.
buddy. It's very important for us to marry up.
Yeah. Okay, so one format I'm going to really, really recommend you try at least once is Winchester. And I'll give it a super quick overview, but there's tons of links. I can find you some resources online later. But basically what you do is you just have a pile of cards. It's usually 90. You can also do it with 120. And you make 4 piles. So you just take the top 4 cards, lay them out. One player picks one of those 4 cards. You then put 4 more cards out on the same pile. So now you'll have a pile of 1, and then 3 piles that each have 2 cards. Then the next player picks a card, or picks a pile. You pick the whole pile. So maybe I take a pile of 2, and then you lay out 4 more cards. So every time you pick, yes, thank you, Obvious Cloud. They're all face up. All face up. Everything's face up. You get the same open information that you get from things like grid draft, where you know exactly what your opponent's drafting and you can very readily hate on something. But it makes some different choices because as a pile gets bigger, if a pile gets bigger, it's probably because there are less optimal cards in there, meaning cards you don't want for whatever reason. They're not in the color that you want, the archetype, whatever. As that pile gets bigger, it gets more appealing because you get more options. Sometimes then also a really good card lands on top of some cards that you're like on the fence on, and all of a sudden you'll take them and you have a big pile of cards to choose from. The other thing is, I think it is a little bit... I've done a bunch of Winchester and a fair bit of Grid, and I think Winchester's a little bit less restrictive in the sense of like the way that colors... Like someone was saying in chat with Grid, like sometimes you're just in a color because you need that row, and like you just get a card. Winchester lets you bounce around a little bit more and be a little bit more focused, so I think you'll have a better chance at getting into like a more narrow two color deck with Winchester. So that's one of my favorites, and it's a variant of Winston. Winston is very similar, but it has face down cards, and you peek at them, so you know some of what's in there. For mismatched level of familiarity with the cards, meaning if you can look at most of the cube and recognize each card on sight from the art, and your partner cannot, they're at like 50%. Winchester's a great way because everyone just sees everything, and no one has to like remember cards that are super new to them. Whereas maybe someone else is like able to remember those cards quickly because they're just so familiar with them. If that makes sense. So that's a format that I would strongly recommend trying. I like Winchester, or I like Winston as well, but I think Winchester's a good place to start in an environment like this.
Do you have a favorite two-player draft format, Anthony?
I enjoyed grid draft the most.
Yeah.
But
Yep.
I don't have a favorite. I feel like it depends on what your goals are. Like if you told me this was always grid drafted, that would change my feedback on the cube pretty dramatically from being always burn drafted. Like, for example, I think a pancake draft, you can draft an aggro deck where you're taking like nothing but 1-2 increase that converted mana cost spells and like going all in on being fast. It's way harder to do in Winchester or grid drafting, where you end up getting a lot of incidental picks, like JJ pointed out. Like you're getting that middle card in the row, you're getting those other cards in the stack, kind of medium on. And so I feel like in those formats where you end up with incidental picks, it's oftentimes better to aim for a more greedy, mid-rangey deck that's playing all three colors or doing whatever. And so I think it depends on your goals for what you want your format to look like. But you can draft a more focused deck with pancake drafting. I often feel like the burn decisions are not as interesting as the format would make them seem to be. Like you just burn the cards that are good against you, you burn the best card in the pack, and you like, it doesn't feel like an actual decision. You're just like burning stuff that you don't want to play against if it's actually really good. You like one of my favorite strategies in like the burn drafting, which once your opponent knows you're doing it, can be kind of they can kind of catch on and like get you with it. But I oftentimes early on, like in the first third or half of a pancake draft, will just burn every card in my own color. Just basically like totally box out. Like I'll take my cards and I'll burn shitty cards in other colors. Who cares? Like just make sure this person I'm passing to gets the message that like you can't have blue or black cards.
No red.
And then again, this is ignoring their signals completely, like ignoring what they're passing me totally. And then in the second part of the draft, I will just switch to burning the opposite colors and assume that I've put them in those colors regardless of what they're passing me. And that's actually worked out pretty well for me historically. And the fact that works so well makes me feel like, burn drafting, it's like you can just do this game where you just intentionally hate out whatever colors you don't want them to be in, and then just move to hating out the colors you put them in because they had no choice because they were getting nothing but those colors in sort of the second part of the pack.
That's exactly why I don't really like burn drafting. Like it's a way to sort of replicate a draft with a larger player group, which is to say there's a draft with unknown information. Like different people are taking different things. You don't really know what different people are taking. You only have a small subset of the information. And so burn drafting kind of replicates that, but it just introduces a different metagame. And I think that there are optimal strategies within that metagame, like what Andy just described. But I'm not like those aren't appealing to me. Like maybe if that was all I was doing and I did a lot of it.
Have you considered it's fun to win?
Yeah, but like I think that those strategies are very one-sided or they're very degenerate. Like you just have to commit early and you get into that kind of like, I'm going to burn only the color that I'm taking. And then if both players are doing that, like I don't think that
Yeah.
over 10 drafts that adds up to a fun game.
Well, it's also
All right, so
on
I
rails,
said-
right?
So that's why I really like grid draft, because as a 2-player draft, it really offers a lot of what I love about limited, but it just embraces the fact that it is a face-up public information game. And the positive maybe is that hate drafting actually becomes something that is like constrained and knowable, but possible.
I just got a brand new idea for an amazing 2-player draft
All
format.
right, here
Check
we
this
go.
out.
Here we
We're
go.
inventing it
It's
live.
It's
I
a-
hate it already.
It's a burn draft format like pancake drafting, but instead of getting to pick 2 and burn 2,
you pick
you
two
pick
and
two?
burn random.
well, you pick like, let's say there's like 8 left in the pack. You pick the top 4, and then you burn at random from that top 4. So you say like, these are the 4 I don't want to play against, but you don't look. You burn at random from them. Pass
So
the
here's-
pack back to your opponent.
Here's one that came up in my Discord. I'm gonna fuck it up, and I don't think she's here because I think she's in like a wicked late time zone. I'll look it up and I'll post it. But she was actually talking about doing. I think she did like 4 packs of 12 with like 4 players, but they'll draft either once around the table or twice, and then burn the last 4. So like they just
Yeah.
don't wheel the last bit, and it's a similar like you're burning some stuff, but it's more like.
Yeah, I mean that, but like the shape of
I think
that
that's sort of
game
shortcuts.
is so different.
Those
than,
are
like,
probably the cards that are going to be in your sideboard anyway.
Right.
Like,
Yes,
it doesn't really
yeah,
change
you're
much
just
about
it's
it.
so
shortcutting.
different
Yeah.
than you saying like
Yeah.
I'm going to like pass my first pack back and I'm
Right.
going to take 1 card and burn a card
And
like,
burn one, yeah.
Yeah,
No,
when,
for
it,
sure
when
it's
it's
different.
your last couple cards versus like
Yep.
I'm trying to send a signal by trying to double pick in my or like
Right.
pick and burn in the same colors.
Yep.
It adds a weird level of strategy that I think is just
It's also this level of strategy which I think should be avoided, where it's like everything is public. I mean, if you're doing burn drafting, you see the whole pack and then you pass the pack. The only hidden information is whatever card was in the first pack your opponent took first. Otherwise, you know every card in every pack. You could, if you were playing optimally, take notes and say, all right, these are the 4 cards that are missing from this
Right.
pack at this stage. What colors are they in? Which one do I think
Right.
they took versus which one do I think they
Right.
burn? And that would probably be the optimum way to do it, but it sucks. No one's going to do that.
Yeah.
It sucks to take that many notes and like remember all those things.
I mean,
And so
we
you
should
don't.
say-
You just
we
kind of
should
wing
say,
it.
Some people are brilliant. Some people are much, much smarter than me. And they will do the burn draft and they will remember everything and they will understand exactly what their opponent
We
has
can't
burned
all
and
be
picked.
Sean, okay?
Can't all be Sean.
Can't all be
Can't
Sean.
all be Sean. These draft formats can be fun for certain people.
Well, here's the
Fun
other-
for me.
They're not fun for me.
Here's the
We
other
got a good
thing.
question.
Here's the other thing.
We got a good question from Conflicted Cylon, though. Maybe you were going to bring that up. Jay.
Yes, I will. And I just want to add one last thing, which is just like drinks and sexual positions, variety is the spice of life. So you don't have to
Corn dog.
draft.
I've been having the same drink all night. So.
Yep, and look what you're missing out on. So but the point is like, so again, I my main cube started as a 2-player cube, and it was so much fun that I actually built an expansion to make it like 8-player size, but I still maintain that core 2-player cube. And my very good friend who helped me build it and I work with, like when barring pandemic, like we draft it probably every other week or so, just, you know, whatever, end of a work shift, we'd be like, hey, we're done early, let's knock out a draft. And based on the kind of mental attention that you have, you know, whether you're feeling like a little spicy or you just want to like chill and play a little Magic casually, you can change your format. Like, as you said, you know, burn can be a little bit more on rails. So like maybe, especially when you're in the groove, you know your opponent because it's your partner, you know the cube because you've been playing it a lot. You can just knock off a pancake draft like super fast, and you kind of know what you're going to end up in, and that's like casual and chill and fun. But you can spice it up and try. Like I have drafted this cube in paper, my cube in paper, at least 4 different ways, and like we've also done a roto draft with it. Like we'll make a spreadsheet online and we'll spend like 3 days, you know, leading up to when we know we're going to play, just picking back and forth. And then I'll bring the cube, we'll pull the cards and play right away. Like there's so
Have
many
you ever laid
ways.
it all out on a big table? We did that once.
No, that
Great.
sounds like a
The
nightmare.
Empress of History draft. It was
No.
really fun. I don't know why you like it was so awful. Why are you like, you know, what are you doing? What's this expression over here? You had fun.
Oh,
I'm
man.
just sad that our friend Dan, who crushed us all, didn't have more fun.
He didn't have fun?
Oh god.
He didn't tell me that. I thought he had fun.
It was a long time.
Anyway,
It's so much work.
it's a lot. Anyway, so Conflicted
Yeah.
Cylon had a good question. So
Let's
we
do
were
it.
talking before about I said specifically, if this were to be grid drafted, I would have very different direction than if it were to be pancake drafted or whatever else. And Conflicted Cylon asked, if it were to be exclusively grid drafted, what changes would you implement? And basically, I think because of the reasons I mentioned, when it's grid drafted, you have a little bit less control over your entire pool because you're taking cards incidentally when they're on rows or columns that happen to have other cards you want. I would basically assume that both decks drafted by either player are going to be competing on similar axes. Yep. Like you're not going to have one dedicated aggro deck, one dedicated control deck. You're going to have decks that are operating at similar speeds and playing similar-ish strategies. Yep. And so to that end, what I would cut is like the stuff that is only good in aggro shells. So I'm looking at stuff like Isamaru, stuff like Step Links, Hellhound, Zergo Bellstriker. Like those cards are only good if your deck is full of very cheap cards that pressure your opponent. And as soon as you're going to end up in some kind of mid-range slog, you just want to get full value out of each card. You don't want 1 mana 2/2. It's not going to sort of hold up anymore. Similarly, I would also probably at that point shave the other end of the spectrum and look at stuff like Shatter the Sky and those other kinds of cards because A, it's public information. So if your opponent got a Shatter the Sky, you know it. And that kind of makes this frustrating, like, okay, I know you have a board wipe and you're not playing any creatures, so I'm also not going to play any creatures, and now we're just kind of staring at each other. Game theory question of like, I know you have Shatter the Sky. And it also then rewards people. It kind of like, it becomes a gotcha where their deck also is full of creatures, right? Like I'm looking at this cube. You're not going to win other than by filling the board with creatures and attacking your opponent. Yeah. And so really they're only going to play into Shadow the Sky if they're way behind or if they sort of get it in their opening hand and are just going to hold back threats until they can get you on a 3-for-1 with a board wipe. So I would sort of swap those out in favor of more targeted removal, more things that interact with the board in a more targeted way to basically allow your players to choose what are the threats I care about, what are the things I want to get off the board to kind of allow me to push my advantage, as opposed to these kind of big swingy like archetype and strategy defining cards like the aggro cards and the dedicated control cards.
The narrow stuff
would basically mean that, you know, you accept at that point that we're grid drafting. You're going to have cards that are off strategy sometimes, or you're not going to be able to always kind of commit to getting all the aggro cards because the aggro cards might be, you know, top left corner, middle right column, and like bottom center right row or bottom row. And then all right, you can't get all three of them. You can only get one of them in the pack. And so those are the things that would basically push you towards if you were doing dedicated grid drafting. If you were only doing pancake drafting, then I think almost the opposite applies. Like looking at a card like Step Links or Isamaru here, it's like those cards are good, but they're really only good, again, if your deck is full of 1 and 2 drops that are going to pressure your opponent. And looking at this list, it seems like I have to be really, really lucky to get enough 1 and 2 drops to pressure my opponent because there's only a small handful in, you know, white and red to actually like get that job done. Something we've talked about in the show before, which is kind of interesting, is that the amount you have to support an aggro deck doesn't actually really scale down much when you change the size of a cube because, you know, my cube has aggro in red, white, and somewhat black. But really, I only support like 1 aggro white drafter. Like I don't expect 2 people to be successful in white aggro on my cube. And so the number of white 1 drops I include is like as many as I think a dedicated white aggro drafter needs, and maybe a couple more, you know, because of just variance in the packs. Maybe somebody's in a Boros aggro thing and is going to play a couple of those white 1 drops or whatever.
Well, or there's like 4 in the same pack, right? Like sometimes just
that happens sometimes too, just random noise in how the packs are distributed. So here, seeing like you have Dauntless Bodyguard, Isamaru, Step Links, which are like dedicated aggro cards. Herald of Anafenza and Threadbane Inspector belong in other. I mean, they can work in aggro because any 1 drop is kind of viable in aggro if it attacks your opponent and gets their life total down. But they also work in other decks. Like I'm happy to play Threadbane Inspector. My mid-range deck replaces itself. You know, it provides a body on the board. Similar in red, you know, Hellhound, Swift Spear, and Zergo Bellstriker are like kind of full-on aggro cards. Dragon Master, Outcast, Grim Lavamancer are a little more flexible. In those sort of situations, we're really looking at like 3 dedicated 1-drop aggro cards in each color. And if I'm playing like aggro, I want to get my opponent dead, even though they have better cards than me. I'm going to try and kill them before they can even cast them. Then I want to have like 8 1-drops in my deck or something. And so if this was full-on pancake drafted, that I would almost push for the opposite. Like get some of this other like 3 and 4 mana stuff that's like mid-range good stuff out of here. Really give me full-on aggro support so I can like choose early in the draft to take these 1-drops and prioritize those and punish my opponent for taking anything that costs 4 mana or more. And it entirely depends on how the cube is drafted, which comes back to this point of like, it's very hard to design a cube that fits all use cases and all purposes and all people.
Yep.
And so it really depends on how you want to use it.
Yep. Something
I wish I stopped you when you were just talking about the grid draft because
I disagreed with stuff a while ago, and then you
Yeah.
kept talking, and I started disagreeing less.
but
But
then
I'd like to go back to the
I
point where I
thought-
disagreed with
I
you.
thought more about why I disagree with it because I think I agreed with you, but then I thought more about that we were both wrong, and there's another reason why we're both wrong, which is that
I'd love to both be wrong.
in a grid draft, it's not just the fact that like we don't get this number of synergistic cards to create an aggro deck. It's also that your opponent knows you're trying to draft the aggro deck, and
Yeah.
they will
Yeah.
take those cards from
Yeah.
you. Like
They'll just take Wall of Blossoms, and then
But-
what are you going to do? You're going to lose. They have an 0-4 that draws them a card.
But more importantly, you don't want to play a 2-player draft format where it's like in an 8-player draft, it's like, oh, great, cool. I'm mono red. You drafted the blue control deck, and you lose to my mono red deck. Great, like that's part of the rock paper scissors of it, and that's
well,
what
I
makes
don't
it
actually
fun.
think a rock paper scissors meta is particularly healthy.
Well, but
go
like
on.
we can imagine a rock paper scissors meta is healthy when you have more than like 2 players in a 2-player format. If you're just saying like, oh yeah, you watched me draft the aggro deck and you still just chose to draft the control deck, and because of that you lost. Like that's not. There's no space for that to be fun.
Well, but I disagree because I think that there is room. Like, first of all, I don't think in any cube you should be like, well, this deck is just going to beat this other deck 100% of the time. Aggro always beats control, and just like throw up your hands and say that's just how Magic works.
Right.
And so in my cube, like I have one of my goals for my main cube is strongly delineating aggro, mid-range, and control. I want the aggro decks to be as fast, as aggro, as ruthless as possible.
But if you're talking about a 2-player grid draft, like those kinds of archetypes are so parasitic. Like you need 12 Jackal Pups in order to make that kind of aggressive deck work. And those Jackal Pups are just shitty outside of it. Like I don't think you can have a fair 2-player meta where it's fun, where you feel like you're having a game with your opponent, where it's not just like, watch me keep taking these Jackal Pups, and are you going to let me get the 12 Jackal Pups? Like I think.
But at what point is your control opponent going to start taking Jackal Pups from you? That's not going to help them. They don't want Jackal Pups in their pool.
Yeah, you don't want to fight over.
They'll start taking lightning bolts.
Well, yeah, that's my point. Is they're going to start taking the control cards that are really good against aggro,
Yeah.
of which there should be some in most cubes that have both control and aggro. Like your Pyroclasm is just like a Wrath of God that costs 2 mana for aggro or for control.
Yeah.
Then you, as the aggro opponent, could do the opposite and say, all right, I'm going to take my equipments, I'm going to take my vehicles, I'm going to take my stuff that gets around your sorcery speed, mass removal, and allows me to continue to pressure the board, even if you're like, these decks should have like interplay against each other.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's where it settles, is that a face-up draft format, if we're talking about grid draft, is just like it's going to be complex interactive Magic if you're trying to play it in optimal.
Well, but again, to remind you, I'm not saying, I think if this is face up, I would not support the 12 Jackal Pup aggro, because at that point it's like, you're just watching me take the Jackal Pups, who cares?
Right.
That's where I think you should really aim for the sort of what people will call flavors of mid-range. I mean, I'm a big advocate for the fact there is always an aggro deck in any cube.
Yeah.
What that aggro deck looks like, how much slower or faster it is than the other decks is kind of relative. But yeah, whether that band of speed is much narrower and you're in more flavors of mid-range territory, that's what I think it makes more sense for a grid draft. Pancake draft, that's where you can do it and just say like, I don't know what you're drafting.
All right, so
we get to the end. Turns out, oops, I'm the aggro deck. Sucks to be you because you didn't think about that and you didn't draft any Wall of Blossoms or I'm not even sure what a control would look like in Naya. What would a control deck look like in Naya? Like,
Naya control could be sick.
I mean, sure, it could be. I'm looking at it here. You just play ramp and like white removal spells, I guess.
Just
A green
removal
white.
spells and then slam a Godsire and say go.
Is Godsire's not even in this cube. That's Anthony's
That's our first recommendation.
Godsire.
So, real quick to kind of try to encapsulate some of what you were both talking about with small cube, because here's the other thing, like a lot of this is focused on the draft and the play, right? What we've talked about, and I want to take a little bit of a step back and talk a little bit about the kind of at least one meta consideration for designing a small cube. And one of the reasons I really like that Cylon started with a limited color pool is I always recommend anyone who's going to start a 180-ish card cube should start by limiting it in some way. There's like, 20,000 Magic cards out there or something like that. Trying to choose 180 of them is already challenging.
Designing a cube is hard as fuck.
Designing a 540 cube is super hard, and you wanna chop that down even smaller, it's just so hard. So finding some way to just sort of say like, I'm going to cut, by cutting out blue and black, I'm going to cut out 2/5 of, or roughly because artifacts, but whatever. I'm going to cut out something like 2/5 of what I have to consider, and I'm going to narrow my focus a little bit, can help kind of make it so that the cube doesn't feel like it's just all over the place. And even in stuff like these sort of, degenerate tuberts, degenerate microcube environments, you're doing that by saying, I'm going to focus on these like broken, legacy and or vintage, depending on the flavor, because there's a few different versions of that kind of concept out there. But I'm going to focus on this very kind of definable play pattern or play style, right? This power level. So
he loves that stuff. He loves doing broken vintage.
Oh,
stuff.
I bet.
He's a true degenerate.
He's a big fan. So one of the things to think about when doing that is, and this is where I feel like I'm going to say kind of the same thing y'all were just saying, but a little bit differently. Would not. It's very helpful, right? I'm just going to repeat what you said slightly differently and sound smart. That's my plan. That's why I bring on really good co-hosts. I always recommend anyone looking at a 2-player cube should not actually worry too much about archetypes in the way that we talk about them in cube. When you've got something like 450 cards and you can support a Flyers deck, and you can overlap that with a Esper control deck, and then you can overlap that with these couple combo decks or whatever, that's fine. With 180 cards, finding that overlap, even if you've already limited it down to Naya, it's so hard. It's so hard to actually be like, and then on top, like, and that's going even deeper than just saying I'm going to support like the 3 pillars of Magic, right? Like aggro, mid-range, control. On top of that, then you want to have like this narrow like landfall archetype. I mean, just like both of you were saying, in a grid draft, like, are you even going to get enough landfall cards to play that deck? And the answer is probably no. So that being said, I think the better way to approach this is to think of whatever you're putting in as themes. And that's a narrow distinction, but what I'm getting at is if you look at something as like a microcosm package that fits into a variety of kind of deck styles, I guess one way to look at it is flavors of mid-range. What's a good example? So Restoration Angel is a good card, right? Because if you literally have anything that ETBs, Resto Angel just does it again. And it also gives you a body.
It's a 3/4 flyer with flash,
right.
JJ. It just eats a creature.
Exactly. It's just a good card. So if you put that in with the 3 other best or your favorite either blink or copy cards that will let you get an extra ETB value, but also maybe have their own body or have another value in some way. So like you put in Resto Angel, Ephemerate just because it's fucking efficient as hell, and Spark Double, right? Because Spark Double is just another of your best creature at the time. That isn't a blink deck, but it is a theme that you can pursue within your larger deck. So if you pick up 2 or 3 of those, you're heading in that direction, and you can start prioritizing ETB creatures or cards that you are going to want to copy with Spark Double, stuff like that. But you're not tied into this sort of critical mass deck, which is what you're talking about with aggro, right? Is certain decks and certain archetypes require critical mass of something, whether it's Jackal Pups or something else. Kill spells, sweepers, aggressive or not aggressive, efficient creatures for certain types of mid-range. Avoiding things that are critical mass based and aiming more for things that can be thematic packages lets you, in my experience, which is limited in some extent, it lets you kind of mix and match these different themes, and you end up with a lot more variety because you've got, themes A, B, and C one time, but then themes B, C, and E another time, and you end up, yes, you see a lot of the same things. I mean, it's 180 cards. You're going to see the same things over and over again, but you're not trying to tie yourself into these really narrow, restrictive critical mass archetypes. You're just trying to assemble a package or two or get a theme going. And if there's some interplay between 2 of the themes, it's really exciting, You can be in Flyers and Blink at the same time. That doesn't mean that every creature's a flyer or every creature has ETB or Blink, but you've got a few of each, and that by itself is cohesive enough to smash face.
Yeah, I mean, stop me if I'm wrong, but I think like what you're getting at is that the fact that draft is fun because as you're drafting, your pick order changes. And your pick order changes because all these cards have little interactions with each other. And if you're either on too far on either end of the spectrum of like just the cards are good or bad, or the cards fit into a specific silo or they don't.
I took my Goblin deck and my Elves deck and my blue counterspell deck and just shuffled them together and called it a cube.
Then you're not really making interesting decisions. It's just like, oh, all right, I got a goblin. Now I have to take only goblins to make my goblin deck work. That's not really much more fun than just taking all of the control cards. Like the point is the complex interactions actually really add to the fun for certain types of players, which I think we both fall into.
I'm not convinced you can be so far on the other side of that spectrum, though. Like, I've never seen a cube where the cards were all so flexible and so good that you were like, I don't care what else I'm taking. I'm just taking the best card of every pack and just jamming it in. You have to care about your curve. You have to care about your density of threats versus your removal, types of cards in your deck. Like, I'm not so convinced you can be so far on the other end that your draft picks lose their relevance.
I'm not convinced in the other way.
Great. Fight.
I mean, I think you could just have if you just throw together a cube of random cards, you can definitely end up in a space where it's like, yeah, some cards are just objectively better than others. And like,
if the power band is wide, but you're not talking about a wide power band, you're talking about how much cards are parasitic to one another and only care about being in a specific deck. You could have a perfectly even power band. Every card is exactly as powerful in a vacuum. And then depending on how much synergy there is, they could belong in a specific deck together or not. Or you could have cards that were all independently powerful. I'm arguing even if you have a situation where your cube is nothing but lightning bolts and whatever counterspell and creatures are exactly as powerful as lightning bolts, you still have relevant decisions to make about which colors am I in, what sort of curve am I drafting, what's my density of removal versus interaction versus threats.
All right, we're trying to set up a straw man as an example.
Look, that's what cube content is, man. I mean, what are we doing? There's no one here talking about the other perspective.
There is a theoretical extreme of like you just take the best card of every pack and it doesn't matter.
Right.
I think if you feel like you're at that point, then you should. That's a perspective where, like, in grid draft, you should reconsider that because
but even in a normal like,
I've never drafted a cube like that. Even cubes that I've heard players, not you, I've heard other players call certain cubes like, oh, this cube's nothing but boring repeated effects of the same like good effects. Like I just take whatever from my deck. I still think drafting is hard, and there's a lot of decisions to make based on what you've already taken and then this sort of. Signals you've gotten from other drafters. How hard can we
make it, and how hard do we want it to be?
Well, how often do you want people to fail and totally fail? This is a question I would pose with the Degenerate Microcube. In the Degenerate Microcube, you can totally fail a draft. I mean, really fail. Like your deck doesn't have a win condition. Like you're like, I sure hope I can kill them with this Judge's Familiar because that's the only way I have to get my opponent's life total below 20.
Wow.
Familiar.
Anywho,
oh boy.
I mean, but like at its core, do you just agree like that there is a balance between synergy and power in a vacuum, and when synergy is like when you have the right balance where it's like I'm going to end up with an effective deck, but if I prioritize things in the right way, and the more complexity there is, to the more different local maximums where you can like find effective decks that involve different cards. That's what really appeals to a long-term, repeatedly playable.
I think what you're describing, though, is that you need a format where it's not just tempo and not just value that matter. Like, there are some draft formats where value is all that matters. Tempo is irrelevant. And so you can that's like where the 5-color good stuff decks reign supreme, where you're like, I just took fixing and any card that cost 4+ mana and had a lot of power, raw power. I didn't care about what happened in the early turns of the game. I didn't care about having a sort of cohesive strategy. My cohesive strategy is I played all the powerful cards that the cube designer thought would only end up in like the 2-color deck of that color combination, but ended up in my deck.
Yep.
That's where the problem comes in. I don't think that's actually as related to the thing you were talking about, or on that same axis as what you were talking about. I think you can have a cube full of very powerful cards where that's still not the most optimal strategy. Because if tempo really matters, then you have to sort of has this question of like, all right, how does my deck prioritize tempo versus value? And how am I going to sort of address both those axes, as opposed to just saying, well, I know tempo is irrelevant because of whatever facts of this format, so let me just focus on value, or vice versa. I've never seen a cube that was so focused on tempo that value didn't matter. The DMC is kind of close, but it still does matter. That's why cards like Serene Remembrance are playable.
Okay.
Anyway, Conflicted Cylon has a question. How do you make a Flavors of Midrange cube avoid the value tempo pitfall trap? I think there are...
Wait, what is the value tempo trap?
I think he's just saying, like, they're just saying, it's he, just saying that make sure that both value and tempo still matter, and it doesn't devolve to just value mattering when you're doing Flavors of Midrange.
It's Josh!
Hey, Josh is here. Hey, we just doxed Josh, I think. Did we dox Josh last time he was on? Anyway, it's we. I think it's a relevant question. So there are lots of, again, Flavors of Midrange. This is all relative because in your cube, whatever's the fastest deck is the aggro deck. It might not resemble the 12 Jackal aggro, but it still is the aggressive deck in the environment. Yeah. So I think it's important to think about what kinds of aggressive cards don't lose value when they're up against a mid-range opponent. And a Jackal Pup loses a lot of value when you're up against a mid-range opponent. Because what you want your Jackal Pup to do is you want to play it on turn 1, and you want to attack for 6 to 8 damage before your opponent plays a blocker or answers it. Or you want to force them to use a removal spell on your dumb 1-drop, and then you feel great.
Right.
And what you don't want your Jackal Pup to do is immediately be facing down a 3/3, because then it's garbage and doesn't do anything. There are plenty of more tempo-focused aggressive cards that don't... We're getting a request for a fist fight.
I'm just thinking about Josh's full address.
So that's Jet. There are cards that care about tempo that are aggressive cards that don't lose value so steeply in a game where they know their opponent's also going to be doing mid-rangey stuff. So some examples that come to mind, like a card like what's the zombie wizard that Dreadhorde Arcanist. Dreadhorde Arcanist is a good example of a card that is very tempo focused. It's a 2-drop that starts attacking and has relevant, effect on the board that doesn't immediately become irrelevant as soon as your opponent plays a 3/3, because you can still play it. You can even attack with it and then pump it, or cast a removal spell or something. It kind of acts on both axes. So I guess I would say avoid whatever cards are only focused on tempo, and that's where the sort of Jackal Pups come into play. When you're talking about a card that's just expecting to be on an empty board or not a face sort of opposing creatures for a while, then you're really focusing on a tempo only card. But there are plenty of fast cards that also care about. I mean, a good example is in your own list, like Grim Lavamancer is a 1-drop that doesn't lose value as the game goes on. That becomes more relevant as the game goes on. And early turns you can attack if you want. Later turns you start picking off your opponent's blockers. That's very relevant. Herald of Anafenza, I think, is a little lower power level, but similar. It's a 1-mana 1/2 that if you're stuck on a sort of stalled board, you can just start leveling it up. I think stuff like Fairy Guide Mother, stuff like Kithian is a good example of a card that it's a 1-drop, but still gets relevant later. You don't have black in your cube, but Knight of the Eben Legion is another sort of example of this I come back to all the time, where it's a 1-drop that can become a very relevant threat later on.
A lot of what these cards have in common is that they have an access outside of their stat block. So they've got either an activated ability, an enters ability, an exit ability, or something that they can do other than simply attack and block. And that is like the very definition of my cube, my small cube, is everything has something other than a stat block, and it lets you do things other than just be aggressive, while also if you build it correctly, by also looking at the stats, lets you do the thing, attack early. But it just has another way. I also think
more targeted removal is relevant in those mid-range slogfests where you want your creatures to still be able to attack, and giving your players more opportunities to say, like, I've got X numbers of threats and X numbers of removal spells. How am I going to balance them? What am I going to decide to remove from my opponent's threats? Is something that comes into play. I see Minor Bug is in the chat. Minor Bug, I know, has played a lot of quote-unquote mid-range focused cubes that have all more flavors of mid-range, tons of fixing land, lots of gold cards. So I think those environments can definitely be successful. And tempo still matters a lot when you can play 2-mana 4/4s like Putrid Leech or like, Tarmogoyf or whatever.
Right.
Like, that puts a clock on very quickly. And so it doesn't just become a game of card advantage, it becomes a game of tempo as well.
Yep.
But your Tarmogoyf also grows into the late game and is not going to become immediately invalidated by a random 3-drop from your opponent.
Right. Yep.
Is that I'm not sure I fully understood what the question about the value tempo problem was.
I thought I explained it perfectly. Maybe I didn't.
What is the question again in different words?
Well, Conflicted Cylon says they love the answer, so I must have nailed the question perfectly.
But
so Cylon, something else to keep in mind, and I think this is I think I got this out of originally out of Sully Singleton, but I know a lot of people do it. One of the things you absolutely should do, I'm trying to find the right one, is start a close, especially with small cubes. Start an almost binder that's literally just stuff that you either wanted to put in the cube but didn't, or cut from the cube for something else. And this lets you really fiddle on a micro level with the cube. So like these are all cuts from my main cube, and I mean it's like getting pretty full now, organized by color. But like when you realize that you cut something and that weakened a deck or an archetype or whatever, or a color, you can just go back and put it back in. And if you want, one way to organize it is to keep it chronologically, meaning every time you cut something, just put it in the next slot. And that lets you kind of have like the overview of where the cube has come from and where it's going.
Yeah. One thing I really wish I had done when I started my cube like 5 years ago was just keep a binder of every card I cut from it and just put like a little post-it note or something on like the sleeve and just say, here's the date it was cut. I would love to have that artifact of like chronological order, all the cards I've cut from my cube. It would just be so nice, but didn't.
Well, and
I'm not going to start now. I'm too lazy.
I started this. This was not. I did not start this with the cube, but it was early enough in the sort of bigger process of like making it a big cube that I did start keeping it in a binder. I keep it by color, so I don't have that chronology. Other than just going back on Cube Cobra, which you can do. I mean, you can also go back if you do all your changes on Cobra. You can just go back and look at the blog, but something like that is useful, and that lets you do things like, right? Okay, so Cylon just said like you can cut the Jackal Pup aggro cards and keep them aside in like a little, put them in one page of a binder or whatever. Ambrose said that his cube cuts fit an 800 count because he's got a long living cube. But you can organize those cuts however you want and keep them together, and like you have a little aggro package. And depending on how sophisticated you get, you can even make certain components of the cube intended for certain draft styles, right? Because we started this whole thing talking about if you're grid drafting, you kind of got to go one way. If you're pancake drafting, go another. You could have 140 cards that are the base cube, and then you could have another 40 cards that are really meant for grid drafting, and 40 cards that are meant. Now this is a lot of work, but you can do it if you're interested in it. 40 cards that are meant for pancake drafting, and you can shuffle in the appropriate kind of package depending on what you think you're doing. And that lets you kind of slide the cube back and forth from different use cases. I think your pooch does not like that idea, though. Is my sense.
No,
they
fine.
object.
Her head is all bone, and she highlighted me by accident.
Oh, down to the count.
Yeah, I mean, I think more the more that we think about it, the one drop aggro just doesn't really function, especially in a 2-player draft. So just like you're saying, set that aside and save it for when we can do a full 8-player pod, and in the meantime, just make it a cube that can work for our 2 players.
Yeah,
I think it can work for 2 players if you really want to support it, but it's the kind of thing where I would maybe like up the draft size a little bit so your cube can be a little bigger, so you can afford to have a whole chunk of cards that just get ignored by both players if they're not playing a dedicated aggro deck. But it's up to you. It's up to matter what you want to support. I think it would maybe require like just a regular pancake draft with 9 packs of 10 cards. It would be hard to support aggro and not have it start to encroach on other strategies, like really, really, really dedicated aggro, and not have it encroach on other strategies just in terms of like slots in the cube.
Yeah, anything narrow or parasitic or critical mass like that is just so hard to do in such a small list. I mean, it ultimately takes up so much real estate. I don't. It's super hard. It's super hard to find that.
The like core concept of if you're going to do a draft and play with one other person, you want the outcome of the actual match that you play to be unknown. Like more mid-rangey matchup. You want there to be options.
That's a part I disagree with. What's unknown about having an aggro deck?
Like if you just say like, cool. Because I've had so many drafts in an 8-player matchup where it's like, Yep, you drafted that deck. I've drafted this deck.
You didn't draft any answers to it?
I didn't draft any answers.
That's your problem, buddy. You got to draft the answers to it.
But in a 2-player draft, either you have drafted the answers or you haven't. And then
But you should have it. You should have drafted the answers. Like you should be in a pancake draft, mostly hidden information. I feel like ideally what you want to encourage is your players to draft with reasonable outs to all major strategies in the environment. The same way you would draft in an 8-person cube. You're trying to win. You're not trying to say, I'm going to crush 6 of my opponents and lose awfully to 2 of them.
Some hidden information, that is a little bit different.
Yeah. Anyway.
Okay. Cool. So, sorry, no, I was trying to catch up on the chat and then trying to also not ignore what y'all just said. There's a lot of threads going on.
Sorry for our friends that are trolling you. You can ban we and Tjornen if you want.
I think they're trolling you, actually.
That is what they're doing. Yeah, you caught it.
Want to be a little more precise. Yeah, no, I think, and this is why I did want to like 2-player cube or small cube, and becomes like this echo chamber for me because I think about it a lot and I talk about it a fair bit, but like haven't had like this deep level of talk. So like I'm also like in my own head, I'm like making notes about stuff I want to think about for my cube later, because another thing with the 180 number that like I've only done a little bit just because of the way it works out with my cube is I recently did a 4-seat draft with the small version. I have 3 fucking versions of this cube now. I have the paper 180. I have the expansion that makes it, an 8-player cube, which I'm gonna bring out to Baltimore Sunday. And then I have the MTGO version of it that I bought because of fucking quarantine, because I wanted to actually play this cube before the year 2022. And that one's diverged from the others, right? So anyway, I played the MTGO version with 3 other people. It was a 4-seat draft, 5 packs of 9. Super different experience, of course, because again, the draft has a lot to do with shaping how it plays out. And so I've started kind of tuning that online list a little bit more towards 4 players, 5 packs of 9, just because I think that's a more fun way to play it on stream. It just gives you more legs, you get more matches, more variety, all that stuff. But that also, again, makes for a different experience. And so tuning the list in that direction requires, a few different lenses. You can then, with 4 players, drafting every single card start. I still think there's not quite enough room to support like a traditional aggro deck, like a critical mass Jackal-Pup deck. But as you said, whatever the fastest deck is the aggro deck. And I think there's room to support something like that. My cube also has like a high curve. So if I supported 1-drop aggro, it would literally never lose, like ever. There is no way to answer it in my cube. And that's something to consider too. I mean, it's all related, right? It's all contextual.
Yeah. The other thing I'll say, we talked a lot about what doesn't work in a 2-player cube. I want to talk about some cool opportunities, I think, with pancake grid drafting, which is if you look at a regular 8-person draft, everyone ends up with a pool of 45 cards and builds a 40-card deck, and they have a certain number of cards that are in their sideboard or they're unplayed or whatever. Actually, Tjornen in the chat did some math and sort of looked at some data for us and figured out that on average, people are pretty much sideboarding like 7 to 8 non-land cards versus, playing 21, 22, 23, 24 non-land cards. And so those ratios are a certain ratio. In a 2-player draft, you have a lot more cards in either pancaked or grid draft that are just not picked, not played at all, which means you have a lot more room, I think, to just put kind of wonky build arounds or like situational cards that only work certain times and just let them kind of live in there. You can put cards in it like if you get them pack 1, you're very happy to build around, but if you get them later in the draft, they're just like dead, because it's having a dead card's a low cost when you're burning, a third of the pack. You can just burn it. Who cares? Like, it doesn't actually matter. So I think that's a cool opportunity for the 2-person cubes, because you get to just put cards in there that, would otherwise in 8-person draft be like, well, damn, I'm in blue and here I am, late pack 2, and this is the blue card left, but it's completely irrelevant in my deck because I'm not playing this weird narrow build around. It feels like you're getting punished a little bit. In a 2-person cube with these draft formats, you get to burn a lot of cards, and so you have more room, I think, to put in a higher density of like fun, weird, novel build arounds and not punish your drafters for it. Anthony does not disagree because he didn't immediately say I was wrong.
I think there's space.
Share smash
is valuable. It's a valuable idea, and we should think about it.
Yeah.
Anyway, so that's something I like about these kind of draft formats.
Mostly, I just want to
You can take her. She's heavy.
No, and thank you for adjusting in that direction, because you're right. I mean, there's a ton about two player draft that I really love. The other reason to go back a little bit to something that we talked about earlier. One, it's a little more intense depending on how you do it on paper, online, whatever. Roto drafting a few times, or doing something like a Solomon draft where there's a lot more open picking. You're not, like grid limits you to a row or column, right? There's a lot of you call it incidental picks. That's what you said earlier that I thought was a smart way to describe it. If you can eliminate some of the incidental picks, you can really see if there's a strategy that's just like broken. So again, like if there's an aggro deck that you just can't answer, it's just going to outshine everything else. You can do something like a roto draft, and if that's the case, it's going to emerge eventually as the deck to beat, and that lets you know where you are succeeding / what needs bolstering. So that's something to throw out there as well. Is a good way to kind of test some of these archetypes, is with like a more controlled draft, like a roto draft, where you can kind of get into it.
Yeah. Have we? This was like the introduction to the cube, and I feel like we monopolized the discussion pretty dramatically, and there was a lot of other stuff we were supposed to get to.
No, I think so. I'll pull up the questions. I think we actually hit a lot of what we needed, and Cylon was here to steer the questions as well.
I think Jarrell and Ironcrag Pyromancer would totally fit here for the reasons we just talked about. I'm not sure how many ways there are to draw a second card every turn looking at the list, but making sure there's enough of those that if you got an Ironcrag Pyromancer, you could build around it. Those are perfect examples of cards that like you don't just put in any red deck or any green deck. Well, Jarrell, maybe you do. It's kind of a fine floor. Is she a 1/1 or a 2/2? 1/2? Just 1/2.
She's 1/2. Yeah, sorry, I just pulled her up. Wow, there's
yeah. They're not just cards you're very happy to jam in any deck, but if you get them in a certain condition of the draft, you're happy to build around them. You also, I think you want to be conscious of adding variance in your two-person draft formats, because if there are just two decks that are easy to get into, that people, can see the signals for, and you're drafting the same pool of cards over and over again. I actually have never done a two-person draft of a cube that only had enough cards for a two-person draft. I've always done a two-person draft of a 360, which has the natural variance of which fraction of the 360 did we just happen to open up. But I think that's something you want to be conscious of, is just, how can we add variance to this? And I think those kind of build around cards, those more narrow cards, can add variance. Like, I managed to draft the deck that cares about spells with the 4 cards that care about spells that I picked up early in the draft and then sort of focused on or whatever. Right.
Something you had just mentioned, what works really well in two-player cube. That's actually one of the motivations for me was, like I said, my original cube was a Pauper 540. Or maybe it was a little less than that, but it was in that range. And drafting that with 2 players was like, it's one of the worst experiences you can possibly have in cube, because you would open like somewhere in early, your third pick or something, doing like a Winchester would be like an elf payoff. And you're like, fuck yes, I love elves. I'm going to do elves. I'm going to do elves. And then you don't see another elf for the whole rest of the draft because they're all in the box. And it's so easy for that to happen. So like, for sure there should be some variance, right? If you draft exactly 180 cards out of your draft, like that's going to be, she's having a good time.
She's fine. We can ignore her.
I don't think I can. She's too good.
She's a very sweet. She's basically a piece of furniture.
Yeah.
She just lets you do whatever you want.
That's amazing.
She's very lazy.
She's a snuggler. But the beauty of two-player cube, bearing in mind that you do need some variance because it's a repeatable draft format and all that, is that you can focus down enough that you don't have that experience of 360 where maybe some of the cards you need for what you're doing don't show up. Again, the critical mass issue. And that doesn't necessarily just have to be in an aggro deck. It could even just be like in your colors. Like maybe you're chasing blue-white and then white dries up because your opponent drafted some of it and most of it's in the box. And that can just happen. The bigger the cube, the more that's a problem. So while I typically recommend 180, another way to allow for a little bit more density of certain effects is to go up a little bit. Make it 200, make it 220. The more cards there are, yes, there will be more variance, but you'll also have the opportunity to stuff in more of certain effects if you need that critical mass.
I mean, that's definitely true, but I feel like it's really important to understand that, like, when you're drafting, I wish there was better terminology, but like, you're dealing with the as fan. You're not dealing with
Well, true. Yep.
the absolute number of cards in the cube. And related to what you're talking about, tribal mechanics, it's like there are two different kinds. There are tribal mechanics that just say get as many elves as you can, and like every elf is better than the next elf. And there are some that are just like, oh, you just need to get like 3 elves in your deck, and then this card turns on.
Yeah.
And those kinds of mechanics, those like threshold mechanics, I think are really, really effective in Cube, where it lets you not just say like, oh, I'm on rails now. Like I have these two like payoffs that just say every card in my deck wants to have this particular mechanic or this particular creature type.
Right. Flyers.
It's like you need one in your deck that I can tutor up, or I just need like one into play to trigger this.
Yeah.
And those end up being really fun because they just let you try and balance things.
I think that's the brilliance of Party as a tribal mechanic.
Yeah, absolutely. Party is that kind of threshold.
Because I actually don't usually love threshold mechanics where it's just like, do you have this thing or enough of this thing or whatever, and then you get some sort of binary payoff. But Party was great because it wasn't really a threshold mechanic. It was like, well, do you have 0, 1, 2, 3, 4? Like
it's scaled.
Threshold mechanics.
Yeah, it's all of these sort of layers which plenty of the cards are playable with only 1 or 2 other creatures that sort of match those creature types. Yeah. And then you get this kind of like live the dream mode of like, I got a full party and I got to do my stupid, Archpriest of Iona beginning of combat. A creature gets +1/+1 against flying, which happens rarely, but does happen sometimes. Yeah, I don't know. I think, to describe exactly what's happening when you're drafting that tribal deck and, it just becomes on rails. It's like if you got 2 tribal lords and now you're looking at a pack, all of the cards that match that tribe are actually much better for your deck than all the other cards in the pack. Like, it's not like you're brainwashed. It's that those cards are the best cards in the pack for you, and there's no question about it. Like, this card is now a 4/4 for 2 instead of, a 2/2 because you have these 2 lords in your deck. So it actually just changes that math that you do where you're deciding, well, what card do I pick? And it's like, well, first question is like, which card is best? And then beyond that, it's like there's other levels of like, well, which one fits my deck archetype more or whatever. Right. And just when you have these tribal cards that are really on rails, it forces you to basically totally adjust those evaluations and say like, well, this card's just a lot better now because of all these other cards that make it way better in my deck. Yep. But that has nothing to do with Cylon's Cube. Why are we talking about this in the first place?
Because I brought up elves. That's the problem, is I brought up elves. But so my bad on that one. But but no, I mean that's a very important, like these knobs become so much more granular when you're looking at such a small pool of cards that like you really do have to pay very close attention to these, and 1 or even 2 cards can make a difference because the pool is so tight and so small. So I think looking at our detailed show notes, I think we hit on most of what Cylon was asking. And Cylon, if you have any last questions, please let me know. One of the questions that he had put in the form was, how do you determine the near optimal number of cards pertaining to any given mechanic? I think we hit that pretty heavily and went on with that. And he had mentioned as well, what are your thoughts on creature to non-creature ratio, and then how about multicolor and lands? We didn't really touch on that specifically, except we did kind of mention, and I think this continues to pertain, when you're aiming more for flavors of mid-range, the more that affects the board, the better. So spot removal and things that land on the board and do things like creatures and certain types of artifacts are optimal, where the more like in the ether cards that, and creating card advantage and stuff like that is important, but like the more cards that sort of don't actually do anything on the board is going to, I think, lessen the mid-range value or the mid-range flavor in the cube. And that doesn't mean there should be none. Like, you still need to draw cards, but if everything is
right. I remember that slightly just to say like I think if you look at every card, you can ask, how does this address the tempo axis and how does it address the value axis? And I would exclude anything that ignores either axis. So leave out your Jackal Pups, which care not at all about value.
Right.
For a card, a Jackal Pup is an awful value.
Right.
Now, for 1 mana and a deck full of other 1 mana threats, tempo-wise, it's a very good value. But in terms of the actual card equity, it's pretty bad. Now, a card like Divination is the other side of the spectrum. Pure value, no tempo. Like, card Divination's awful tempo play, but very good value play. That's a good example of something I would also exclude. Focus on things that are kind of in that middle ground. Some tempo, some value, which will still allow your players to basically choose how they, focus on either of those axes in their own deck and play the cards that maybe favor the tempo axis a little more, favor the value axis a little more, or give them the opportunity to kind of like, bat switch hitter depending on what their opponent's doing.
Or, modal cards that given the current game state, like, sure, we're both playing mid-rangey decks.
Modal cards are great in this situation.
In this particular game, like, is it worth? Like, honestly, those are the most fun Magic decisions. Are when you're like, ooh, I could get a lot more value out of this card later, but in this game, I think it's worth it for me to take the tempo play and play this card now for less value. Maximize those decisions.
To answer your specific question, a card like Bottled Cloister is like pure value. Like, it doesn't affect the board. It's a big artifact that costs 4 mana. It doesn't do anything. And so you're basically like playing this at the hopes of all that virtual card advantage you're going to get. I would avoid cards like that. I mean, I also said earlier that you have room to add some of these more narrow cards. So if it's a card you really like jam it in there and see how it plays. That's the beauty of these kind of cards.
It doesn't have to be zero. It doesn't have to be zero.
Right.
But if most of your cards are tempo or value and ignore the other axis, you're going to be in trouble.
Right. Yeah. I would just say focus on a solid core of cards across a good, healthy curve, mostly 2s and 3s that are focused on both sides of that spectrum, and then include some cards that are way off the edge. And in your current cube list too, there are some cards here that are cool build aroundy cards. Like an example of something like Crucible of Worlds. That card does nothing unless you have specific cards in your deck that take advantage of it.
Yep.
And if you do have Crucible of Worlds and Strip Mine, then you own your opponent and they get ruined and probably can't win the game because that combo's kind of messed up. So you totally have room for that. I will never criticize the inclusion of a card like that here because if the card is bad, it will just get burned every single time and not played. Yep. And you can start looking at your drafts and saying, is this card burned 100% of the time and no one's playing it? In which case, maybe it's a slot I could use for something else. Or is it burned to 80% of the time and 20% of the time it's super sweet and my players love it? And you have room for those cards that are 80-20 cards because you don't need every card in your queue to be playable when you're burning half of it.
Yep.
I think Pabab, I don't know how to pronounce that, made a good point, which is that, Bottled Cloister is minus tempo for plus value. That's how pretty much every value card works. You're always trading one of those resources for another resource. So when you say a pure value card, you're down on tempo for a Divination because you spent 3 mana doing nothing to affect the board. And for that exchange, you get up on card advantage. You get a 2-for-1 to see how things go.
Right.
Hey, it's J Bro. What's up, J Bro? I gotta get water. I was waiting for the bio break, but I'm
do it.
Parched.
Yeah, so obviously
now that he's gone, let's tear this cube apart.
Let's get in there. Yeah, so a really good, we were talking about modal cards. Obviously, I think everyone knows it, but a really good example is something like Mull Drifter that gives you both the modality and the opportunity to get into sort of a tempo and or value arrangement depending on how you need to use it and what the game state is. But it gives you a lot of options, which is obviously very important. So, yeah. So I think I feel pretty good if y'all do as well about and Cylon again. If there's anything that we've not addressed or that we've confused you on, please let us know. But just looking at the time, everything I think would be good to crack into the second cube. Do you boys feel good about that? So one more thing. Just get in there.
Nice bow on this. Is that all right, JJ?
Yeah.
I just wanted to say that I think when you're thinking about these cards that are on the fringes, they are the pure value cards or the port tempo cards or the build aroundy cards that, don't fit in every single deck. I think you have a lot of range there to make them more powerful than the cards that are part of the core structure. Make it a payoff if somebody drafts and builds around one of these cards that doesn't just go in every deck and always perform, so that they're motivated to do that. Otherwise, I think you'll find after a lot of drafts that all of the cards of it just are always pretty good and work really well. if you're playing optimally, you're just taking all those cards. You're ignoring these cards that are risky. Make the risks worth it if someone sort of makes that work. So, yeah, that's my last piece of advice. For those cards that are on the fringes, tweak the power a little bit.
Right.
Make them a little better so that people are encouraged to do it.
That's where you can put in the real high power outliers.
Yeah, put in the spice there. You know, if it's
Yep.
the power outlier, but it costs 7 mana, then you're telling your opponent, you're telling your players, like, yeah, you can win the game if you get to 7 mana. Go ahead, I dare you. Like, try.
Just don't play Hornet Queen, which this cube doesn't include.
Anthony
it's not in there,
first checked to make sure the cube didn't have Hornet Queen, so he didn't have to give you a dressing down on air. Boy, he hates Hornet Queen.
I'll make a note of that when I bring my cube out. That card can be super annoying though. That can be a very frustrating card.
That's not why Anthony hates it. He hates it for pedantic color pie reasons.